Today's video is a request by Commander Philip Ty and Commander Birdmonster. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and if you want to make video requests, you can join the channel at the Commander tier. Thank you very much. Right, today we're looking at a ship that needs no introduction, and that is of course the Intrepid class, very famous and well-known ship. Now I should warn right out the gate, as many of you may know from my bottom 5 video, that I have a little bit of prejudice towards this ship. I have several issues with the design philosophy behind it and some of the technical specifications, because personally I find there to be a lot to criticize in the design. But in any case, we'll get into this and, well, hope for the best. So it was designed by Rick Sternbach, and the design process in and of itself is actually quite interesting. Bearing in mind this is the first hero ship. They've done a hero station, but this is the first hero ship they've done that isn't the Enterprise. And so obviously they wanted to do something to separate it and delineate it from Enterprises, and the result is that it has a very, if you look at the concept art, there is some very wild and very different ideas floating around for what this ship could look like, because obviously one of the main drivers behind this design is that it can't look like an Enterprise. So that's an interesting starting point, because normally that defines Starfleet ships, is you take an Enterprise and then you add bits or you take away bits to get your new ship. This is, you know, almost starting from scratch and building back up towards something that looks, you know, Federation, but of a very different ilk, I suppose. So it's a very interesting design process, and there's a lot of different bits of concept art that were created. Some very interesting, like there was one model that's been built since, which is very kitbashy feeling, with the long nacelles at the back and the more aggressive arrowhead saucer section. But it's a very different design to what we got, but you can certainly see the same spirit of, you know, creating something completely novel. I think this just goes to show discussing Voyager concept art and concept art in general could be a whole nother video. If you want that, let me know in the comments if you'd like me to discuss concept art. Also, bearing in mind, in production there was of course a physical model, but there was also a CG model as well. But that brings us now to the in-universe design. And first and foremost, the thing to mention is there's several misconceptions around the design, and one of these misconceptions is that it was an anti-Borg ship. This is not the case. The reason people seem to think about it in this way is because I think it had quantum torpedoes, although I don't think we ever see it used. The most we see used are tricobalt warheads, and why they were carrying such powerful weapons is in itself an interesting question. It wasn't so much anti-Borg as it was benefiting from some of the anti-Borg upgrades. I emphasize some of them. So basically what happened in the construction process of the Intrepids is, as they were coming closer to fruition, to commissioning, all this anti-Borg technology was beginning to come out, and this is why some of it, like quantum torpedoes, could make their way into the design. But other things, like ablative armor, were less easy to integrate, and this is why it doesn't have ablative armor. So it isn't an anti-Borg ship because it wasn't developed. It just happened to be being constructed at around about the same time a lot of the anti-Borg ships were coming out, but it actually comes from a separate development tree. The development tree for the Intrepid really begins in 2363 with the launch of the Galaxy class. Now, anyone who knows anything about technology projects knows that the moment you get the new product out the door, you start the next one immediately. You start the upgrade, and this is what the Intrepid program was. Starfleet had built the Galaxy class, which was this excellent long-range deep space explorer. And what they wanted to do with the Intrepid program was miniaturize it, make it smaller. It wasn't just miniaturization for the sake of miniaturization, although that's always nice. Galaxy-class ships take some time to build. I know there's no money in the 24th century, but, it's still going to take you longer to build a bigger thing, especially something as big as a Galaxy-class. The reason they wanted to do that was A, be able to build more of them more quickly, but also to free up the Galaxy class, because while the Galaxy classes were launching in the late 50s and early 60s, they weren't really able to do much real intensive deep space exploration. They weren't able to go really far out into deep space and, discover new species and expand their knowledge and chart new star systems. They weren't really able to do that because they were more often required for internal duties, tasks close to home, be they political and diplomatic, as well as military missions. These were all tasks that the galaxies were kept being pulled back in to perform. And that's also why later on you'd also see the Sovereign program take, again, more weight off the galaxy, because, while they have this dual wonderful ship in the galaxy, it's not really any good if it's only doing half of what it's meant to be doing. So the goal with the Intrepid program primarily is to relieve the Galaxy class of a lot of its internal duties and free it up for what it was made to do, which is deep space exploration. And this is where the Intrepid comes in. There's really twofold mission objectives in the Intrepid, and that is, there's a little bit of border patrol, very good as a sort of frigate-sized vessel for that. But there's plenty of New Orleans that can still carry on that mission, but sort of into the future, this will definitely succeed it. So there's that, but the other two key objectives are scientific projects and investigations, and critically, internal as well as some foreign diplomatic duties. This is what the Intrepid was really built for, and this is reflective in its design. The way the ship is built and the way the saucer section is constructed, there's a big emphasis on the various diplomatic suites and lounges. It's very nice for a ship of this size. It's very well furnished for a ship of its size. It also has a rear lounge, which is interesting, just by the shuttle bay, where basically once those diplomats get in, they immediately can go down to the aft lounge, which is interesting. And part of the reason they wanted it for internal diplomatic, more minor diplomatic missions was also because it was felt that the Galaxy class was very often felt to be overkill in the wrong sense of the word. It was too much. You show up to a planet with a Galaxy class ship, particularly if people don't know you, they're going to think you're meaning trouble. Because, look at that thing. The Galaxy class is this really, think about it from the perspective of a civilization who's just discovered warp drive and you've just made first contact with them. And if you make first contact with a Galaxy class, that is just terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. It's this gigantic, incredibly powerful starship that is so powerful. They're so confident in their power that they can even put civilians aboard and not worry about it. That's how powerful the Galaxy class is. That's how overwhelming it feels to be a primitive civilization, an early warp civilization, and see a Galaxy class. So an Intrepid class is much more approachable, much more humble than the Galaxy. It doesn't feel like this huge, overwhelming statement of arrogance and power that the Galaxy class kind of is. So there's that. One of the other late additions to the design, and this is why it doesn't look so good and work so well, are the variable geometry engines. The Intrepid really sits in a very unfortunate place where it came out before the newer engines that don't hurt subspace had been developed, but after they had realised that this was going on. So they had to do something. They didn't really know what to do, so they used the variable geometry engines, which basically minimalize the warp field. They make it much tighter than you'd normally expect. But this can only occur at warp because otherwise there's too much radiation channeled towards the hull. So it can only be initiated during warp drive. Additionally, the warp engines themselves are a bit of a issue. Because if you look at them, proportionally warp engines are generally equal to either anywhere between half the length of the hull and equal to the full length of the hull. These warp engines are less than half the length of the Intrepid's hull. They're undersized for what this ship is. Partially that's why they produce, a fair amount of radiation for their size, and this is one of the problems you start getting into, is when you start bringing your warp engines closer into the ship. And this is also because they're trying not to hurt subspace, but in the result they're making engines that are quite overtaxed. And again, that's partially why you want to make that warp field tighter, to minimize that warp field. It also means you lose a lot of your warp field maneuverability. You're unable to manipulate and steer the warp field because its distance between the two engines is smaller, which is why Tom Paris says he likes to drop Voyager out of warp, turn it a bit, and then jump it back into warp. But for most ships, that's not necessary. It's just the Intrepids which have this, because it came out at this unfortunate time where they were expected to do something, but they didn't really have the technology ready yet. So it's fair to say that with the Intrepid, the design has evolved a lot between what was put out on the blueprints and the drawing board and what was actually built in the shipyards, because a lot of stuff got thrown in, and this is really where the problems with the Intrepid exist. This is where they emerge from. It's because of all this additional stuff that was thrown in. These were new technologies and people were very excited about them, but rather than wait to put them on stable platforms, they put all of them into one platform, and this does create problems. You do have a very advanced, cutting-edge ship, absolutely, but you have problems too. Now, it does have some very interesting features, actually, and I'll get on to that. So, it has very, very large and very visible sensor arrays, a total of 10 across the ship's hull, mostly on the saucer section. You have that big, long sensor on the front, which leads down to the secondary deflector. And it's a very impressive-looking sensor array, and you've got numerous others across the ship's hull. It's a very impressive number of sensor arrays. It is most certainly an excellent science ship. It also has, as I mentioned, an auxiliary deflector. You can use this if your main deflector gets knocked out. I would also just say don't get your main deflector knocked out. That's generally the best thing to do. But what it is very useful for is as an auxiliary scanning array. You can use that for intensive scans, emitting high energy particles from your secondary deflector dish. So that's an interesting feature that you have. In terms of armament, you have a reasonably simple armament. Nothing out of the ordinary, but effective for a ship of this size for it to fulfill frigate duties, patrol and, that's 11 phaser arrays, and then 4 single-shot torpedo launchers. Now, the reason they went for single-shot torpedo launchers, I may do a video on this. Multi-shot launchers are very large and they're very difficult to fit in. They seem to feel that they wanted to preserve that low silhouette profile that the Intrepid has, and the best way to do that was just to, instead of having this big vertical launcher installed, just have 4 single-shot launchers, and that will kind of compensate for the lower rate of fire. Now, another interesting feature, and I'm pretty skeptical about this, but you do see it on the schematics, and that is 2 warp cores. The primary core is placed further back, and then the secondary core is further forward. I'm not sure how I feel about this. I think that that's a bit of a... We don't see any other ship do it, and we see, frankly, larger, longer-range ships than the Intrepid, and they don't carry secondary warp cores, so I don't know why the Intrepid would. That just sounds like a writer's device to me, and I don't think it was even ever used anyway. I think they just wanted to put it there just in case the writers felt like doing something stupid. And, ships have limited space, and you can't afford to be going around wasting space on a thing that you may need, but you probably shouldn't ever need. Other features include, it's got a decent-sized shuttle bay, but it is only one. It also has the Aero Shuttle, which is a very interesting vessel that we never really get a look at. I think it's worthy of a ship chat of its own, so let me know what you think. So, yeah, that's the Intrepid. It's a very interesting ship. It's got a lot going on, and a lot of interesting details. Personally, I don't really care for the shape of the Intrepid that much. If you look at it from certain angles, it really seems rather rude. That I wouldn't know anything about that, of course. But it was an excellent diplomatic ship. It was a very strong science ship as well, and it was a reasonably decent frigate in combat. Though that was never its primary purpose. It could hold its own and, had the advantages of speed and technology, but there were other fighting frigates that were more effective for that specific purpose. But in the Dominion War, it did see a lot of use in its diplomatic role, and in that it was also excellent. It transported the Federation envoy to Romulus, which is historic, absolutely historic moment. And that's really quite an impressive accolade for this ship to hold. Not many ships can claim that. That's definitely something to be said. But I think, really, as a frigate, it lost out to cheaper, simpler counterparts. So, be that the already existing New Orleans or the highly simplified Interceptor class. Both of those were able to do the combat frigate duties far more. But it's very interesting because fundamentally what the Intrepid represents is this transition point in the Federation where they are between the Golden Age and the remilitarization of Starfleet, lodged squarely in the middle, and it's interesting to see the various contradictions and compromises that were made in the design. So yeah, it's very, if anything, it certainly paints a picture